It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine's face as she stepped out said everything. Something had shifted, something serious, and at the center of it all stood Princess Charlotte. What was dismissed as palace gossip was about to erupt into a revelation that would shake the monarchy's most guarded foundations. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Behind closed doors, far from the ceremonial calm the public had come to expect, an emergency meeting unfolded with an intensity that few within the palace had ever witnessed. Prince William, composed by nature and trained from birth to conceal unrest, was said to have abandoned that restraint, his tone firm, his posture defensive, as royal advisors laid out concerns that could not be ignored. Catherine, usually the embodiment of poise, listened in silence, but when she finally spoke, those present reportedly felt the gravity of her words linger long after they were said. This was no ordinary discussion, no routine royal matter wrapped in protocol and tradition. The secrecy surrounding it was suffocating, even by palace standards where discretion is second nature. Staff were dismissed early, communications rerouted, and corridors that once buzzed with quiet efficiency fell into an uneasy stillness. Something was being contained carefully, deliberately, but not entirely successfully. And then came the moment that sent ripples through those watching closely. As Catherine emerged from the meeting, there was a visible shift subtle to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to those who knew her. Her expression carried a weight that could not be masked, a fleeting glimpse of vulnerability that spoke louder than any official statement ever could. It wasn't panic, not quite, but it was close enough to raise alarm. Questions began to form, quietly at first, then with growing urgency. What could have unsettled her so deeply? Why now? And why did every whisper, every guarded glance, seem to circle back to one name, Charlotte? Within hours, the atmosphere around Prince William changed as well. Known for his steady demeanor, he became noticeably more protective, his attention fixed with an intensity that did not go unnoticed. Public appearances were adjusted, schedules subtly altered, and his interactions carried an undercurrent of vigilance that suggested more than mere parental concern. Those closest to the inner workings of the palace began to sense that this was not just a family matter, it was something larger, something with implications that reached beyond the present moment. Meanwhile, palace communications tightened to an almost impenetrable degree. Statements became shorter, vaguer, stripped of detail, as if carefully engineered to reveal nothing while calming everything. But the silence only fueled speculation. Outside those walls, the media began to stir. Journalists, long attuned to the slightest shifts in royal behavior, sensed the tension but found themselves grasping at fragments, unable to confirm what lay beneath the surface. The absence of clarity became its own story, a void filled with theories, each more unsettling than the last. And yet, for all the noise building beyond the gates, the truth remained locked away, hidden within that meeting, and the expressions of those who had walked out of it forever changed. Because what truly lay beneath that meeting was far more complex than concern it touched something ancient, something tied to legacy. Long before it became a family refuge, Anmer Hall stood as a symbol of royal continuity, quiet, enduring, and deeply personal. But now, that sanctuary had been thrust into the center of an unprecedented decision. Why would a future king move so swiftly to alter its destiny? And why now? For generations, Anmer Hall had existed not as a headline, but as a heartbeat steady, unshaken by the turbulence that often defined royal life. Its history was not loud or extravagant, but that was precisely its power. It represented something deeper than ceremony, permanence. When Queen Elizabeth II entrusted it to William and Catherine, the gesture carried more than generosity. It was a silent endorsement of stability, a passing of emotional legacy wrapped in tradition. And over time, that estate became more than a residence. It became a shield, a place where the future of the monarchy could breathe away from scrutiny, where laughter replaced protocol, and where the weight of expectation could, even briefly, be set aside. For the Wales family, Anmer Hall was never just land or architecture, it was memory, identity, and quiet resilience stitched together. It was where William could step out of the shadow of destiny and simply be a father, where Catherine could ground her family in something real, something unshaken by titles. And perhaps most importantly, it was where Charlotte's story began to take shape, not under the glare of royal obligation, but within the safety of inherited calm. Yet even within that sanctuary, the shifting tides of the monarchy could not be kept out forever. Because as time moved forward, so too did the unspoken conversations about what comes next. The monarchy, built on centuries of continuity, had quietly entered a new phase one where inheritance was no longer just tradition, but strategy. Conversations that once belonged to distant futures were being pulled into the present, accelerated by circumstances no one could ignore. King Charles's health, though guarded with care, cast a long and unavoidable shadow over those decisions. It introduced urgency into a system that thrives on patience. And within that urgency, Anmer Hall began to transform from a retreat into a symbol of something far more deliberate. Because suddenly, the estate was no longer just about William and Catherine. It was being reframed, repositioned, almost reimagined as part of Charlotte's future. A future that, until recently, seemed comfortably distant. The whispers grew louder, more focused. Was this simply thoughtful planning, or was it a response to something more pressing, more immediate than the public had been led to believe? The idea of Charlotte tied to Anmer Hall carried weight not just emotional, but symbolic. It suggested continuity, yes, but also adaptation. A quiet reshaping of roles that had long been considered fixed. And that is where the tension began to rise. Because while history provided context, it did not provide answers. It could not explain the sudden acceleration, the subtle shift in tone, the unmistakable sense that something had changed behind closed doors. The sanctuary that once represented calm was now at the center of something far more complex, something that blurred the line between tradition and necessity. And as those pieces began to align, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about preserving the past. It was about preparing for something the monarchy may not have been ready to face. Yet history alone didn't explain the urgency because something had forced William's hand. Within days of that meeting, something changed. Quietly, rapidly. Documents were reviewed, advisors summoned, and behind closed doors, a decision began to take shape, one that insiders claim had been considered for years but never acted upon. Until now. What followed was not chaos, but something far more calculated precision. Legal consultations, once routine and spaced over months, suddenly intensified into a concentrated effort that carried an unmistakable urgency. Senior legal teams, individuals who typically operated in the background of royal affairs, were called into a sequence of discussions that seemed to blur the line between preparation and reaction. There was no public acknowledgement, no formal statement, yet the internal movement spoke volumes. It was as if a dormant plan had been pulled from the shadows and thrust into immediate action. And those who caught even the faintest glimpse of it understood this was not a rehearsal. This was real. The phrase that began to circulate in hushed tones was as striking as it was unsettling: an emergency deed. Not a term commonly associated with the steady, methodical pace of royal estate planning. It suggested urgency, contingency, a need to secure something before it was too late. And while no official confirmation ever surfaced, the consistency of these whispers painted a picture too detailed to dismiss. Something was being restructured. Ownership, control, legacy concepts that once seemed fixed were now being quietly reconsidered. The timing, of course, could not be ignored. With broader uncertainty surrounding the monarchy's immediate future, decisions that once belonged to distant decades were being forced into the present. But what made this shift even more compelling was the evolving role of Catherine. No longer positioned at the edge of these conversations, she appeared to step firmly into their center. Her involvement was no longer symbolic, it was active, deliberate, and deeply engaged. Those close to the process began to note her presence not just as a participant, but as a guiding voice. And that, in itself, signaled a profound transformation. Because this was no longer simply about preserving tradition. It was about shaping it. And Catherine, often seen as the stabilizing force within the family, now carried a weight that extended beyond support into influence. Meanwhile, beyond the palace gates, speculation began to swell. Media circles, ever sensitive to shifts in royal behavior, picked up on the unusual pattern of silence paired with heightened activity. The lack of clarity became a breeding ground for theories, each one attempting to connect the dots between legal movement, and emotional tension. Why now? Why this estate? And why did? Everything seemed to point back to that single, unresolved thread introduced in the meeting, Charlotte. Because beneath the legal language and strategic planning, there was something more personal at play. A sense that this was not just about assets or inheritance, but about protection. About securing a future against forces that had yet to fully reveal themselves. The idea that long-term planning had been accelerated hinted at a trigger, something unseen by the public, yet powerful enough to disrupt the monarchy's carefully maintained timeline. And as those pieces continued to fall into place, one truth began to surface with quiet intensity. This decision, however complex, was not being made lightly. But as the legal machinery moved into place, one question remained: who was this truly for? At just a young age, Princess Charlotte had always stood slightly apart, confident, imposed, and quietly significant. But now, she was at the heart of something far bigger than anyone expected, and those closest to her were moving quickly to protect what they believed was rightfully hers. There had always been something different about Charlotte's place within the royal family. Not louder, not more visible, but deeper, almost symbolic. In a monarchy defined by hierarchy and expectation, her presence carried a quiet disruption of old norms, a subtle shift towards something more modern, more balanced. From the very beginning, those who observed closely sensed that her role would not be confined to tradition alone. And as the years passed, that quiet significance began to evolve into something undeniable. Public interest in her future grew steadily, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a recognition that she represented change and evolution of legacy that the monarchy could no longer ignore. But with that attention came pressure, and within the walls of the family, that pressure was not abstract, it was deeply personal. Prince William's connection to Charlotte began to reveal itself in ways that were impossible to overlook. His protectiveness was no longer just instinctive, it became deliberate, almost strategic. Every gesture, every adjustment in presence, carried the weight of a father who understood that his daughter's future might be shaped by forces beyond her control. And Catherine, grounded yet fiercely devoted, stepped even further into her role not just as a mother, but as a guardian of something far more fragile than titles. Her involvement was no longer simply nurturing, it was purposeful. She was not just raising a child, she was helping to secure a place within an institution that had rarely made space for change without resistance. And that is where the emotional core of this unfolding story begins to tighten. Because what was happening behind closed doors was not driven by ambition, it was driven by protection. The idea of securing Charlotte's position early was not about favor or preference. It was about ensuring that she would not have to fight the same silent battles that others before her had endured. It was about rewriting a narrative that had long been accepted without question. Discussions around modernizing royal inheritance, once theoretical and distant, suddenly became immediate and deeply relevant. And at the center of those discussions stood a young girl who, perhaps unknowingly, had become a symbol of that shift. The weight of that realization was not lost on those closest to her. It lingered in the decisions being made, in the urgency that now defined conversations once carried out with patience. This was not just planning, it was positioning. Carefully, intentionally, and with a sense of quiet determination, the family began to shape a future that felt both necessary and inevitable. Because beneath the structure of tradition, there was an understanding unspoken, yet powerful, that the monarchy could not remain unchanged forever. And Charlotte, whether by design or circumstance, had become central to that transformation. And then, quietly but definitively, the decision was made. No announcement, no ceremony, just a signature that would redefine the future. In a move described by insiders as both unprecedented and deeply symbolic, Prince William signed the document that would change everything. It did not arrive with the grandeur that typically surrounds royal decisions of such magnitude. There were no carefully staged appearances, no layered statements designed to guide public reaction. Instead, it unfolded in silence, deliberate, controlled, and absolute. The so-called emergency deed, whispered about in corridors and speculated upon in fragments, was no longer theory. It had been finalized. And with that single act, Anmer Hall was no longer just a place of refuge or memory, it became something far more significant. Its future now formally and irrevocably tied to Charlotte. For those within the inner circle, the meaning was unmistakable. This was not a gesture of sentiment. It was a calculated move, framed carefully as a long-term protective measure, yet carrying an undercurrent of urgency that could not be ignored. The language surrounding it was precise, almost clinical: stability, continuity, foresight. Words chosen not just to explain, but to contain. Because behind that controlled narrative lay a deeper truth. This decision had been accelerated, pulled forward by forces that demanded action rather than patience. And William, standing at the intersection of duty and fatherhood, had made his choice. The implications were layered. On the surface, it reinforced continuity, a seamless extension of royal planning, ensuring that legacy would pass forward without disruption. But beneath that surface, it signaled something more profound. It suggested that the monarchy, so often anchored in tradition, was willing to adapt when necessary, that it could act decisively when the future required it. And perhaps most striking of all, it revealed the personal dimension behind the institution. This was not just a prince making a strategic decision. This was a father securing a future he could not fully predict, but clearly felt compelled to protect. And yet, despite the weight of that action, the palace chose silence. No detailed explanation followed. No attempt was made to shape the narrative beyond the bare minimum. It was as if the act itself was meant to stand alone, unspoken yet undeniable. Advisors, when pressed, leaned into the language of reassurance, emphasizing continuity over disruption, calm over curiosity. But their restraint only deepened the intrigue. Because when an institution built on visibility chooses silence, it rarely does so without reason. Within those walls, the decision may have felt final, resolved, contained, carefully placed within the framework of royal strategy. But beyond them, the story was only beginning to unfold. Questions lingered, not just about what had been done, but why it had been done now, and what it revealed about the shifting dynamics within the monarchy itself. Because in that quiet, decisive moment, something fundamental had changed. The balance between tradition and adaptation had tilted, however slightly, toward a future that felt less certain and more urgent than ever before. But while the palace remained quiet, the outside world was anything but. The moment the news began to surface, the reaction was immediate and intense. Questions flooded in from every direction. Why Charlotte? Why now? And what wasn't being said? What had been executed in silence within palace walls erupted into a storm the instant it brushed against the outside world. Media outlets, caught between fragments of information and the pressure to deliver clarity, scrambled to piece together a narrative that refused to stay still. Headlines shifted by the hour, each one attempting to capture a truth that remained just out of reach. Confirmation was elusive, statements were scarce, and yet the momentum refused to slow. Because this was not just another royal update, it was something sharper, something that hinted at change beneath the surface. Royal experts quickly stepped forward, but instead of providing clarity, they deepened the divide. Some framed the decision as a natural evolution, a forward-thinking move designed to secure stability in uncertain times. Others questioned its timing, suggesting that such urgency rarely appears without cause. The interpretations clashed, overlapping and contradicting one another, creating a landscape of speculation where certainty became impossible. And in that uncertainty, the public found itself split. For some, there was admiration, a sense that decisive action signaled strength, protection, and a willingness to adapt. For others, there was confusion, even unease, as the lack of transparency left too much room for doubt. Then came the force that magnified everything: social media. What began as quiet speculation transformed into a relentless surge of theories, opinions, and unverified claims. Every detail, no matter how small, was dissected and reinterpreted. Patterns were drawn where none had been confirmed, and connections were made that blurred the line between insight and imagination. The narrative, once contained within the boundaries of controlled reporting, began to spiral outward, growing faster, louder, and far more unpredictable. Comparisons to past royal decisions only added fuel to the fire. Observers reached back into history, searching for parallels that might explain the present. Moments of quiet inheritance, strategic repositioning, even controversies long thought settled, each was brought forward, examined, and layered onto the current situation. But none of them fully aligned. None of them carried the same combination of urgency and silence. And that difference became impossible to ignore. Through it all, the palace remained steadfast in its approach, minimal comment, no elaboration, no attempt to engage with the growing storm. It was a strategy, rooted in tradition, yet in this moment, it felt almost defiant. Because while silence can preserve dignity, it can also invite speculation. And as the narrative expanded beyond control, that silence began to speak in its own way, suggesting that whatever lay beneath the surface was not something easily explained. The story had moved beyond a single decision. It had become something larger, a reflection of a monarchy navigating pressure, expectation, and the delicate balance between past and future. And as the noise continued to build, one realization began to take hold, quietly but persistently, beneath the chaos of headlines and opinions. Yet beneath the headlines, a deeper meaning was beginning to emerge. What initially appeared as a sudden decision was, in reality, something far more calculated. A move not just about the present, but about shaping the monarchy's future in a way that few had anticipated. Because when the noise settled and the speculation began to thin, a clearer pattern started to take shape, one that pointed not to urgency alone, but to intention. This was not a reaction built overnight. It was the result of long-term thinking within the Wales family, a quiet but persistent effort to prepare for a monarchy that would look very different in the decades to come. The decision surrounding Anmer Hall, the legal precision, the silence that followed it all began to resemble a carefully constructed framework rather than a rushed response. And within that framework, every move seemed to carry a dual purpose: to protect in the present while securing the future. At the heart of this shift was a subtle but undeniable signal, a monarchy beginning to modernize, not through grand declarations, but through strategic action. For generations, inheritance had followed a rigid path, shaped by tradition and rarely questioned. But now, there was a sense of flexibility emerging, a willingness to adapt those structures to meet a changing world. Securing assets across generations was no longer just about continuity, it was about resilience. And in that context, William's actions took on a new dimension. He was not simply preserving legacy, he was redefining how it would be carried forward. His children, once seen only as future figures within an established system, were now being positioned with deliberate care. Each decision hinted at a broader vision, one where roles were not just inherited, but strategically aligned with the demands of a modern monarchy. And within that vision, Charlotte's place stood out not as an exception, but as part of a larger recalibration. It suggested that the future would not be bound by the same limitations as the past. That change, once resisted, was now being quietly embraced. Catherine's influence within this evolution cannot be overlooked. Her perspective, grounded yet forward-thinking, appeared to shape not just the emotional tone of these decisions, but their direction. She brought a sense of balance, a bridge between tradition and transformation. And in doing so, she reinforced the idea that this was not just about royal duty, but about family, about ensuring that each step forward carried meaning beyond protocol. Together, William and Catherine seemed to be crafting something new, something that honored the past while preparing for what lay ahead. The broader implications of this shift began to ripple outward. If one estate could be repositioned, if one role could be redefined, what did that mean for the structure as a whole? The monarchy, long seen as unchanging, now appeared capable of evolution in ways that were both subtle and profound. And at the center of it all was a single, unifying objective: stability. Not the kind that resists change, but the kind that anticipates it, absorbs it, and emerges stronger because of it. And in the end, the decision revealed something even more profound. In the quiet aftermath, as speculation settled and headlines faded, one truth remained. This was never just about a house. It was about legacy, about protection, about the future of a monarchy standing at a crossroads. Because when the noise finally softened, what remained was not controversy, but clarity. Anmer Hall, once framed as a retreat, a private escape from the demands of royal life, had transformed into something far more enduring. It had become a symbol, not of comfort, but of continuity. A place where past, present, and future quietly converged. And through that transformation, it revealed the deeper intention behind every decision that had come before. This was not about reacting to pressure. It was about preparing for it. About ensuring that when the weight of the crown shifted once again, it would land on foundations that had already been carefully secured. At the center of that preparation stood William, not just as a prince, but as a future king, stepping into a role that demanded more than patience. It demanded foresight. His actions, once viewed through the lens of urgency, now appeared as something far more deliberate. He was not simply preserving what had been handed down to him, he was actively shaping what would be passed forward. And in doing so, he embraced a reality that few before him had confronted so openly, that legacy is not something you wait to inherit. It is something you build, piece by piece, decision by decision, long before the moment arrives. But no legacy is shaped in isolation. Catherine's presence within this unfolding story was not just supportive, it was transformative. She stood at the intersection of tradition and change, carrying both the responsibility of royalty and the instinct of a mother determined to protect her children from the unseen pressures of their future. Her influence added depth to every decision, grounding strategy and emotion, ensuring that what was being built was not just strong, but meaningful. Together, they created a balanced one that allowed the monarchy to move forward without losing sight of what made it endure in the first place. And then there was Charlotte. No longer just a quiet presence within the royal narrative, she had emerged as something more, something symbolic. Her significance was no longer defined by expectation alone, but by the role she now occupied within a shifting structure. She represented possibility, a future that was not bound by the same rigid lines that had shaped the past. And in securing her place early, the family had done more than protect her, they had signaled a willingness to evolve. Because the monarchy itself was changing. Not dramatically, not in ways that demanded attention, but subtly, intentionally, adapting to pressures that could no longer be ignored. The shift toward proactive decision-making, once unthinkable in an institution built on tradition, now felt necessary. It was no longer enough to preserve. The future required preparation, anticipation, and at times, bold action taken in silence. And in that silence, something powerful had taken root. A new understanding of duty, not as obligation, but as responsibility to those who would come next. A recognition that family and institution were no longer separate forces, but deeply intertwined. And as that understanding continued to shape every choice, one final truth stood firm, steady against the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Because in the end, the crown isn't just inherited, it's carefully, deliberately protected for those who come next. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.